Welcome, colleagues. I am so incredibly thrilled to have you here today for this interactive explainer. Now, I know you're already absolute experts in your respective disciplines. You bring such an incredible depth of knowledge to your teaching. So today, we're going to embark on a collaborative exploration of learning science, specifically looking at the Technology-Enhanced Active Learning, or TEAL, pathway. Let's go ahead and dive right in.
As a quick reminder, the TEAL Professional Development course provides us with a few different ways to learn. You could have chosen a guided reading with annotation, or maybe a faculty podcast followed by a group discussion. But since you selected this interactive explainer, well, you're going to be engaging directly and actively with the material right here as we go through it together.
And because you chose this pathway, I actually want to set a really quick expectation right off the bat. Throughout our time together today, I'm occasionally going to ask you to pause and respond to some questions. When I do, I highly encourage you to literally pause this explainer and really think about your answers. Why? Well, as we're going to discover, true active learning happens through active thought, not just by sitting back and passively watching information wash over you. So, are you ready? Let's get started.
To frame our whole discussion, let's jump straight into Section 1, 2 classrooms, 1 question.
Picture this. Imagine walking into 2 different college classrooms on the very first day of the semester. In the first classroom, you see a beautifully engaging lecture. The instructor is delivering information flawlessly. The students, they look perfectly attentive, taking meticulous notes, nodding along, maybe occasionally answering a prompt. At the end of class, everyone walks out feeling like the lesson was a massive success. But then, right next door, we have a totally different scene. The instructor has just presented a really complex problem. Small groups of students are debating possible solutions. They're comparing evidence, defending their reasoning, revising their ideas, asking each other tough questions. The instructor is just circulating, offering a little guidance here and there, but definitely not just handing out the answers. This second room is significantly louder, much less predictable, and honestly, maybe even a little uncomfortable.
So, here's your very first opportunity to pause and think. Which classroom do you believe is more likely to produce meaningful, lasting learning? Take a second, hit pause on the explainer right now and predict your answer. Is it that smooth, traditional lecture, or the messy, loud, problem-solving room? Welcome back. At first glance, it is so easy to just assume the loud room is doing active learning and the quiet room is traditional lecture. But the reality is actually quite a bit more nuanced. See, students can appear physically engaged while doing basically zero meaningful thinking. And on the flip side, a fantastic lecture can totally include moments that demand deep, rigorous cognitive work. The absolute crucial takeaway here is that mental action matters significantly more than physical appearance.
Which perfectly tees up Section 2, examining the evidence. Let's see what the data actually says about all of this.
For decades, educational researchers have been on a quest to figure out if active learning really improves student outcomes compared to traditional lecturing. And that brings us to a frankly monumental piece of research. Back in 2014, Scott Freeman and his colleagues published a hugely influential meta-analysis. And they didn't just look at a couple of classrooms. No, they synthesized findings from 225 independent studies. These studies compared lecture-based instruction with active learning in undergraduate STEM courses, covering literally thousands upon thousands of students.
The findings? Well, they were stunningly consistent. Students enrolled in active learning courses not only earned higher exam scores, but they were significantly less likely to fail. In fact, students sitting in traditional lecture-based classrooms were approximately 1.5 times more likely to fail than those experiencing active learning. The researchers even pointed out that if these studies had been randomized clinical trials in medicine, the experiments might have been halted early. Why? Because one treatment, the active learning, had so clearly demonstrated superior life-altering outcomes.
And that specific data led to this incredibly famous quote from Scott Freeman. The impact of these data should be like the Surgeon General's report on smoking and health in 1964. Now, just to be perfectly clear here, Freeman wasn't saying that lecturing is literally physically harmful to your health, like smoking a cigarette. But his point was that the accumulated evidence supporting active learning has become so unbelievably overwhelming that our debate in higher education simply has to shift. We've got to stop asking whether active learning works and start asking how we can implement it effectively.
Which leads us directly to our next pause point. If the evidence was already this overwhelmingly compelling way back in 2014, why do you think traditional lecture still completely dominates so many college classrooms across so many disciplines? Have you seen this research discussed in your own department? I want you to pause the explainer again right now, really think about the factors that either speed up or slow down the adoption of research-supported teaching practices in your specific field. Welcome back. It's a really complex issue, isn't it? Things like long-standing tradition, severe time constraints, and frankly, a lack of formal training in learning science all play a huge role in this.
And that brings us to Section 3, redefining active learning. Because if the evidence is this strong, we need to be crystal clear on what we are actually talking about when we use that term.
The phrase active learning gets thrown around a lot to describe, well, basically anything that isn't just listening to a lecture. But listen, active learning is not automatically about physical movement in the room. It's not just having group discussions or polling or using fancy new technology or simply keeping your students busy. Now, can group work or simulations promote active learning? Absolutely, but they don't guarantee it. Think about it. You can easily have a lively group discussion where absolutely no one is learning anything new.
The real defining feature of active learning is cognitive engagement. Educational psychologist Herbert Simon famously observed that learning results exclusively from what the student does and thinks, period. That is the very core of learning science. Students develop real, lasting understanding when they are required to retrieve information, explain concepts in their own words, compare alternatives, analyze evidence, and revise their own misconceptions. Basically, they learn by actively wrestling with ideas, doing the mental heavy lifting themselves, rather than just acting as passive receptacles waiting to be filled with information.
So, let's tie this all together in Section 4, connecting to prior learning. We're going to see how this core definition connects to the evidence-based strategies we actually explored in the previous TEAL module.
You see, active learning isn't just some separate, isolated tactic. It's really the overarching instructional framework that makes all those prior strategies work, because they all require students to think. Take retrieval practice, for example. It literally forces students to reconstruct knowledge from their own memory. That is pure cognitive engagement. Interleaving asks students to evaluate a problem and determine which strategy actually applies, rather than just blindly repeating a single procedure over and over. Spaced practice strategically revisits concepts over time, forcing students to cognitively reconnect with earlier learning. And Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, that encourages us to remove unnecessary barriers precisely so we can preserve the productive cognitive effort that meaningful learning actually requires. Active learning is simply the environment where all of these fantastic strategies can flourish.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, the instructor's shift, because the real question is, how does everything we've just talked about change what you actually do on a day-to-day basis?
First off, don't worry. The instructor remains absolutely essential. You are not being replaced. But your role does transform. It shifts from primarily delivering information, where your main goal is just broadcasting content to a room, to designing experiences. You essentially become an architect of learning. You're intentionally structuring the environment so that your students are forced to retrieve, evaluate, apply, and create. You are the one designing the complex puzzles and problems that make them do that crucial cognitive work.
And that brings us to our final question. Did you happen to notice that over the last few minutes, you just participated in an active learning experience yourself? By watching, sure, but more importantly, by pausing to predict outcomes, by evaluating the Freeman evidence, and by constructing your own meaning around cognitive engagement, you took a medium, an explainer, that is traditionally very passive, and you turn it into active learning. You just experienced the exact instructional approach this whole lesson was designed to teach. So as you prepare for your very next class, here's my final thought for you to chew on. Are your students just sitting in the room, or are you intentionally designing the experiences that force them to do the heavy lifting? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, and happy teaching.